The ship drifted through the cold, dark void of space, a lone ghost gliding in the depths of the universe. Its name was a whisper in the forgotten corners of history, its existence shrouded in secrecy. The Black Ship. A name that held so much power, so much fear, yet no one seemed to remember why. No records. No data. Just fragments of old rumors. But the crew aboard the Horizon had just begun to unravel a truth that had been buried for centuries. The Horizon's crew had spent weeks searching for any trace of the Black Ship, sifting through databases, logs, and archives both human and alien. But every lead led to a dead end. Not a single official record, not a whisper of the ship's existence, could be found anywhere in the vast reaches of the galaxy. It was as if the Black Ship had been deliberately erased from every record, as if someone or something had gone to great lengths to erase it from history. The ship was a void, a black hole in the data of the universe, and no one knew why. Suspicion had begun to creep into the hearts of the crew. They weren't the first to search for the Black Ship. Many before them had sought it out, only to disappear without a trace. Some said it was a myth, a story passed down through the generations, while others believed it to be an ancient weapon, lost to time. But the crew of the Horizon wasn't interested in the stories. They were after the truth. They needed to know what happened to the ship. And most importantly, they needed to understand why no one wanted them to find it. Days passed, and frustration began to set in. The crew had found nothing. The silence of the universe pressed in on them like a weight, the cold emptiness of space closing in from all sides. It felt as though the universe itself was hiding something from them, something they weren't meant to understand. The Black Ship had become an obsession, a puzzle with pieces that refused to fit. But then, just as hope was beginning to fade, something unexpected happened. It started with a simple anomaly. A small fragment of a transmission, barely decipherable, appeared in the data logs. At first, the crew thought it was a glitch, some stray signal bouncing off a nearby asteroid or some other space debris. But as they listened closer, the transmission grew clearer. It wasn't much, just a few words, but the warning it carried chilled them to the bone. Don't follow it. Don't wake it. The words repeated over and over, like an ancient chant, growing louder with every passing moment. The message was cryptic, its meaning unclear. But one thing was certain, it was a warning. A warning about the Black Ship. But who had sent it? Why had it appeared now, after all these years? And most importantly, what was the warning trying to tell them? The crew stared at the transmission in stunned silence, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had been searching for the Black Ship for so long, and now, they were being told not to find it. But who were they to listen to? The warning seemed to hold the weight of something ancient, something dangerous, yet it offered no answers. It only raised more questions. And the most pressing question of all was this: what would happen if they ignored the warning and continued their search? The tension aboard the Horizon grew. The crew was divided. Some wanted to turn back, to abandon the search before it was too late. They had already come so close, and yet the danger of what lay ahead was undeniable. Others, however, were determined to push forward. They believed that the Black Ship held the answers to questions humanity had long sought to answer. They believed that if they could find the ship, they could unlock its secrets and change the course of history. But as the days passed, the message haunted them. The warning echoed in their minds, whispering in their ears like a voice from the darkness. Don't wake it. The more they listened to the transmission, the more it felt like a threat, as if something or someone was watching them, waiting for them to make the wrong move. The crew had no choice but to press on. They couldn't turn back now, not when they were so close. They had to know what happened to the Black Ship. They had to understand why it had been erased from history, why it was hidden from the galaxy. As they neared the coordinates where the Black Ship was last known to have been, the tension reached a boiling point. Every sensor, every piece of technology aboard the Horizon, was on edge. The silence was deafening, the stillness of space pressing in like a vice. And then, as if on cue, the ship's systems began to flicker. Lights dimmed. The hull groaned. An eerie hum filled the air, growing louder and louder until it seemed to drown out everything else. The crew's hearts raced as they realized something was happening. The black ship was out there, waiting. And they were getting closer. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the hum stopped. The lights returned to normal, and the ship stabilized. The crew exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what they had just experienced. Had they triggered something? Had the black ship somehow detected their presence? And then, out of nowhere, the transmission returned. But this time, it was different. It was no longer a warning. It was a command. Stop. It's too late. The voice on the transmission was low and gravelly, like the whisper of the wind through ancient tombs. It was a voice that carried with it an air of finality, as though it had been speaking for eons, waiting for this moment to arrive. The crew froze. The words echoed in their minds, sending shivers down their spines. Was it a warning? A threat? Or was it a desperate plea? The crew was now on the edge. The black ship was out there, and whatever it was, it had been waiting for them. But what would happen if they ignored the warning? What lay beyond the unknown? As the horizon drew closer to its destination, the crew had no idea what awaited them. They had come so far, but now they were faced with a decision that could change everything. The black ship was within reach, and the mysteries it held were too great to ignore. But the warning "don't wake" it hung over them like a dark cloud. The crew knew one thing for certain: they were no longer in control. Whatever happened next would be beyond their understanding. And as they prepared to make their final approach, a new transmission flickered on the screen, just barely visible through the static. It was a single sentence, clear as day. Everything you know is a lie. The crew stared at the screen, their hearts pounding. What had they gotten themselves into? And more importantly, what had they awoken? The answers were out there, hidden within the black ship. But whether they would ever find them, whether they would survive the journey to uncover them, was a question that lingered in the cold, dark void of space. The horizon drifted through the black void, its engines humming softly as it cut through the stillness of space. The crew had grown used to the silence, but tonight, the stillness felt different. There was a tension in the air, something that couldn't be explained. The words from the transmission "everything you know is a lie" echoed in their minds, haunting them like a dark spectre, but no one dared to speak them aloud. They had all heard it, all felt it, but none wanted to confront the weight of those words. The black ship had always been a myth. A story passed down in hushed whispers, a tale used to scare children, to warn them of the dangers that lay beyond the known galaxy. It was supposed to be a fragment of history, a dark chapter that no one cared to revisit. But now, the Horizon's crew was faced with the undeniable truth: the black ship was real. It was out there. And it was waiting. Captain Reynolds stood at the front of the command deck, staring out into the endless expanse of space. His hands gripped the railing, his knuckles white from the pressure. The crew had always trusted him, always followed his lead without question. But now, even his resolve was beginning to waver. The transmission had rattled him more than he cared to admit. He had seen a lot in his time, but this was different. Something was wrong. The black ship wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a warning. Beside him, Lieutenant Harrington stood with her arms crossed, her eyes focused on the star charts flashing across the screen. She was a seasoned officer, pragmatic and level-headed, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes that she couldn't hide. She'd spent years studying alien technology, working with data from races far older than humanity. But nothing, not even the most advanced civilizations, had prepared her for this. The black ship wasn't just a ship, it was something far more dangerous, far more ancient. "We're getting closer," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We should be within range of the coordinates in the next few hours." Captain Reynolds turned to face her, his gaze steady but troubled. "Do you think it's still out there?" he asked. Harrington hesitated. "I don't know. But we've already seen the signs." The transmissions. The anomalies in the system. Whatever this is, it's not normal. The captain nodded grimly. We're not turning back. We've come too far. Lieutenant Zane, the ship's chief engineer, paced nervously in the corner of the command deck, his mind racing. He had been studying the black ship's coordinates, trying to decipher any hidden patterns or clues in the data, but so far, it had been an exercise in frustration. Nothing added up. There were no records, no traces of anything related to the black ship, as if it had been intentionally wiped from the galaxy's history. Every system they accessed had been wiped clean, every database scrubbed of any mention of it. It was as if the ship had never existed at all. Zane was no stranger to secrecy. He had worked on countless projects shrouded in mystery, but this was different. It felt as though someone was trying to prevent them from finding the truth. But who? And why? He glanced up at Captain Reynolds, who was still lost in thought. Captain, Zane said, his voice urgent, there's something off about the data we've been getting. I've been reviewing the logs, and it's like someone went through and erased all traces of the black ship. It's as if we're not supposed to find it. The captain's gaze snapped to Zane. What are you saying? Zane swallowed hard. I'm saying someone powerful doesn't want us to know the truth. They've gone to great lengths to make sure the black ship is forgotten. But we're getting closer, and I think we're about to uncover something that's been hidden for a long time. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the weight of Zane's words. No one spoke, but the implications were clear. If the black ship was being hidden, then it was more than just a ship, it was a weapon, or a key, to something greater. As the hours passed, the horizon inched closer to the coordinates, and the tension in the command deck grew unbearable. The crew could feel it, a sense of impending doom that hung over them like a storm waiting to break. Every system on the ship was primed, every crew member alert, but the sense of uncertainty only grew. Finally, the moment arrived. The horizon passed the last line of defense, the final boundary between known space and the unknown. And there, in the distance, they saw it. The black ship. It was enormous, dwarfed only by the vastness of space itself. Its dark, metallic surface shimmered in the faint light of distant stars, its shape unnatural, as if it had been designed by a mind that didn't follow the same laws of physics. The ship seemed to pulse with a strange energy, a rhythm that felt almost alive. And as they drew closer, the sense of unease intensified, the weight of the unknown pressing in on them from all sides. This is it, Captain Reynolds said, his voice barely audible. We found it. But even as he spoke, the crew couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a mistake. Every instinct told them to turn back, to flee, but they couldn't. They were too close now. They had to know what lay within the black ship. Prepare for entry, Reynolds commanded, his voice steady despite the tension that gripped him. We're going in. The crew scrambled to their stations, the hum of the horizon's engines growing louder as they made their final approach. The black ship loomed ahead, its surface dark and foreboding, a monument to something ancient and powerful. No one knew what awaited them inside, but they all knew one thing for certain: the universe would never be the same after they boarded it. As the horizon's airlock sealed and the crew prepared to disembark, the transmission came through once more. The voice, low and rasping, echoed in the command deck. Stop. It's too late. But this time, the voice was different. There was a sense of desperation in it, a fear that hadn't been there before. The crew exchanged nervous glances, their fear growing. What had they awoken? And then, as the airlock doors opened and the crew began to move toward the black ship, the lights flickered once again. The eerie hum returned, louder this time, vibrating through their bones. It felt as though the black ship was alive, waiting, watching, as if it knew they were coming. Captain Reynolds stood at the front, leading the crew into the unknown, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what they would find within the black ship, but he knew one thing: nothing would ever be the same again. And then, as they crossed the threshold into the darkness, the doors slammed shut behind them. The airlock slammed shut behind them with a heavy thud, its echo reverberating through the dark corridors of the black ship. The crew of the Horizon stood frozen for a moment, eyes wide with disbelief. They were inside the black ship, finally facing the mystery that had haunted them for so long. Captain Reynolds took a slow, steadying breath, his mind racing. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but he couldn't. Not now. They had come too far. The words from the transmission, "Everything you know is a lie," played over and over in his mind. Who had sent that message? What did it mean? Was it a warning, or was it a threat? His thoughts were muddled, but one thing was clear: the crew wasn't prepared for what they were about to encounter. The crew gathered in the dimly lit chamber they had entered, the air thick with tension. The walls were covered in strange, glowing symbols, their meaning completely foreign to their eyes. The ship's architecture was unlike anything they had ever seen, alien, yet disturbingly familiar. There was something unsettling about it, as if the ship itself had been designed with a purpose that no one could comprehend. The floors hummed with a soft, rhythmic vibration, and the air was cool but still. Despite the eeriness of their surroundings, there was no turning back now. Harrington was the first to break the silence, her voice tense but resolute. "We need to stay focused. Let's stick to the plan and gather as much data as we can." Reynolds nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was a subtle thing, like a whisper on the edge of perception. He glanced over at Lieutenant Zane, who was scanning the surroundings with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. "I'm not getting any readings," Zane said, his voice laced with uncertainty. "No life signs. No power source. It's as if the entire ship is dormant. But these systems," he gestured toward the glowing symbols on the walls, "they are still active. I don't understand it." Reynolds didn't know what to make of it either. The black ship was clearly not a place built by any known civilization, but the technology was alive in its own way. It was a ship that seemed to breathe, as if it were more than just a machine. The air in the chamber had an odd, almost tangible quality to it, as though it were infused with a strange energy. "Let's move out," Reynolds said, forcing his voice to sound calm, though inside, his pulse was quickening. The crew followed him through the narrow corridor that stretched ahead, their boots echoing softly on the metallic floor. As they moved deeper into the ship, the walls seemed to close in around them, the faint hum of the ship growing louder, more intense. It felt as if the black ship was alive, waiting, watching, with an intelligence of its own. After what seemed like hours, they arrived at a large chamber, its walls lined with strange, alien technology. At the center of the room, an enormous console hummed with energy, its surface etched with the same glowing symbols that adorned the rest of the ship. The console seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and a strange sensation filled the room, as though the air itself were charged with electricity. Harrington approached the console cautiously, her fingers hovering over the intricate symbols. "This is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's not even close to anything in our database." Reynolds stepped forward. "Can you make sense of it?" Harrington studied the console for a moment, her brow furrowing in concentration. "I don't know. But there's something here. Something I can't quite grasp. These symbols, they're not just language. It's like they're communicating, but not in any way I've encountered before." Zane joined her at the console, his eyes scanning the symbols. "It's almost like the ship itself is trying to communicate with us. But it's not clear, not in a way we can easily decode." A chill ran down Reynolds' spine. Communicate with us. The thought lingered in his mind, unsettling him further. It was as if the ship knew they were there, knew who they were. And it wanted them to know something. Just as Reynolds was about to speak, a low rumble echoed through the chamber. The lights flickered, and the hum of the ship intensified, sending vibrations through the floor beneath their feet. The walls seemed to shimmer, and for a brief moment, the entire ship felt as if it were alive, pulsing with some unseen energy. Then, a deep, resonant voice filled the chamber. It wasn't human. It wasn't even a language they recognized. But somehow, they understood. The voice echoed in their minds, bypassing their ears altogether. "Why have you come?" The voice was calm, almost soothing, but beneath the surface, there was something colder, darker. Something that hinted at the vastness of knowledge and the danger of disturbing it. Reynolds stiffened, his heart racing. He exchanged a glance with Harrington, who looked as stunned as he felt. The voice had come from the ship, and it had spoken directly to them. I don't know how to respond," Harrington whispered, her voice barely audible. The voice spoke again, this time more insistent. "You are not meant to find this place." The word sent a ripple of fear through the crew, and even Zane looked shaken. He had spent his entire career studying alien technology, but this was different. This was no ordinary machine. This was something ancient, something far beyond anything humanity had ever encountered. "You have awakened it." The voice continued. "It was never meant to be disturbed. The consequences will be grave." The hum of the ship grew louder, the air thickening with a strange, oppressive energy. The crew instinctively took a step back, their eyes wide with fear. What had they done? What had they awakened? Reynolds took a deep breath, his mind racing. The voice was clear now, its words like a warning, a final plea to leave. But they couldn't. Not after everything they had been through. They had come too far to turn back. "What do you want from us?" Reynolds asked, his voice steady despite the rising panic in his chest. "Why were we brought here?" For a long moment, there was silence. The air grew cold, and the ship seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. Then, the voice spoke once more, but this time, it was different. It was softer, almost sorrowful. "You are too late." Reynolds' stomach twisted. The word sent a shock through his system. Too late for what? Before he could respond, the ship's systems suddenly flared to life. The console in front of them glowed brighter, and the symbols on the walls began to shift, rearranging themselves in patterns that no one could decipher. The rumbling in the ship grew louder, more intense, and the floor beneath them trembled. Harrington stumbled back, her hand pressed to her chest as if to steady herself. "We need to get out of here," she gasped. "Something's happening. It's not safe." But before they could even think about retreating, the ship seemed to respond, its walls shifting as though they were alive. The room they were in began to warp, the very fabric of reality bending in strange, impossible ways. The air crackled with energy, and the crew could feel it, a force pressing against them from all sides. Reynolds took one last look at the console, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice had warned them, had told them to leave. But now, it was too late. They had already awoken whatever lay hidden within the black ship. And there was no turning back. "Prepare for the worst," Reynolds said, his voice grim. "Get to the exit. Now." But as the crew turned to flee, the walls of the ship seemed to close in on them. The corridors twisted, stretching, and contracting in unnatural ways. The ship was alive, shifting around them, trapping them inside. And then, as they made their way toward the exit, they heard it. A sound, low and guttural, like a growl, coming from deep within the ship. It was getting closer. The ship's walls twisted around them like the coils of a massive serpent, contracting with an unnatural force, sealing them into an ever-shrinking space. The crew ran, their breaths ragged as they pushed through the narrow, warping corridors, the growl low and primal getting louder with every step. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and it felt as though the very ship was alive, its pulse quickening with every movement they made. Reynolds led the way, his mind racing, but there was no clear path. The walls shifted, turning the ship into a maze, and no matter how hard they tried to retrace their steps, they seemed to be going in circles. Their once confident steps had turned into frantic, desperate movements as the growl grew closer, its source undetectable but undeniable. "We're not going to make it," Harrington whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of their hearts. She glanced back, her eyes wide with fear. The ship, it's alive. It's trying to trap us. Zane, who had been silently scanning their surroundings, gripped Reynolds' arm. Captain, look, there's something ahead. A doorway. Reynolds barely had time to process the words before they all rushed toward the door. The room beyond it was dark, its edges bathed in an eerie, flickering light. But it was their only chance. As they entered the chamber, the door slammed shut behind them, and they were plunged into darkness. The growl stopped. For a moment, the only sound was their labored breathing. The ship was silent, its unnatural hum replaced by an oppressive stillness. Every one of them stood frozen, waiting for the next move, for the next sign that the ship had not given up its pursuit. Then the voice came again. This time, it was different, more distant, more fragmented, as if it was struggling to communicate. "Why do you persist?" it asked, its tone filled with a strange mix of sorrow and something darker, anger, perhaps, or something ancient, something that could not be understood by human minds. Reynolds clenched his fists, trying to steady his breath. "We need answers," he said, his voice low and unwavering. "We came for answers. You have to give us something." The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. The only sound was the soft hum of the ship, like the pulse of a heartbeat. Then, as if in response to his words, the air around them seemed to shift. The walls, once dark and oppressive, began to glow with an eerie light. The symbols that had once been inscrutable began to rearrange themselves before their eyes, forming into something that almost made sense, something like a message. "You cannot undo what has been done." Reynolds stepped forward, the weight of those words crashing down on him. "What do you mean?" "Undo what?" The ship responded almost immediately, the light from the walls growing brighter, more intense, as though the ship itself was reacting to his question. "The black ship was never meant for you. It is not a relic, it is a prison. And you have opened it." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. A prison. The black ship, which they had thought of as a weapon or a tool, was something else entirely. It was not a place for exploration, it was a place of containment. For a moment, no one spoke. The implications of what the ship was saying were clear, but none of them dared to voice it. The black ship had been hiding something, or someone, for a long time, and they had just unlocked its prison. A sudden shift in the air, the feeling of something breaking free sent a jolt through their bodies. The growl returned, but now it was no longer a sound of distant pursuit. It was close, too close. The ship's walls seemed to shake with a violent tremor, as if it was struggling to contain what had been released. "We need to go. Now!" Harrington shouted, but it was already too late. The lights flickered one last time, and before they could react, something moved through the darker shadow, monstrous and unfathomable, sweeping through the chamber like a living nightmare. It was fast, impossibly fast, and as it neared them, they could feel the coldness of its presence. A pressure, like a force of nature, crushed the air from their lungs. The crew scrambled toward the exit, but the ship was moving, shifting around them with an intent that felt almost intelligent. It was as if the very walls of the black ship were working against them, slowing their progress, turning their escape into an impossible task. But as the creature's shadow loomed closer, something unexpected happened. The symbols on the walls flared to life, brighter than ever before, and the ship's humming intensified, almost as if the black ship was retaliating against the force that had been unleashed. Then, a voice different from the one they had heard before, deeper, darker, filled the room. "You should not have come. You cannot leave now." The words reverberated through their minds, freezing them in place. The ship had a mind of its own, a consciousness far older and more complex than anything they could comprehend. It wasn't just a ship, it was a prison, a trap, and they had just broken the lock. But as the shadow moved closer, the light from the symbols intensified. The room seemed to bend, distort, and then just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow paused. For a moment, there was stillness. "Do not fear me," the voice whispered, but the tone was no longer menacing. It was calm, almost comforting, but with an undercurrent of something far more terrifying. "I am not your enemy. The ship, however, is. Before they could react, the creature's form solidified. It wasn't a monster at all, but a figure alien, incomprehensible, yet somehow humanoid. Its face was a blur, its features not fully formed, as though it was struggling to hold onto its shape. It spoke again, and this time, the voice was clear. I was once human. But the black ship is not just a vessel. It is a gateway to something much older. Something much more powerful. I was meant to guard it. But now you have freed it. The realization hit them like a freight train. The creature wasn't a monster, it was a guardian, a prisoner in its own right, bound to the ship to protect whatever lay inside. And they had just unleashed it. The room began to shake violently, and the air crackled with energy. The creature's form flickered and faded as if it were losing control. It was no longer in control of the black ship, it was a part of it. And now, it seemed, it was begging for help. You must leave. You must destroy the ship. If you don't. The creature's voice faltered, as if it couldn't finish the thought. But before they could react, the ship's systems flared to life again, this time more violently than ever. The walls pressed in around them, and the floor trembled beneath their feet. The creature's final words were a whisper, but they were enough to send a shiver down their spines. It is too late. The air in the chamber crackled with tension, the walls pressing in as though the black ship itself was drawing them closer to its heart. Reynolds' pulse thundered in his ears, and his breath came in quick gasps. His mind raced, piecing together the terrifying puzzle they had just uncovered. The creature once human had been bound to the ship, forced to protect its ancient secrets. And now, with the ship growing restless, its systems flaring to life, it seemed like all hope was lost. But they couldn't afford to give in. Not now. Not after everything they had seen. There had to be a way to escape this nightmare. Get to the control room. Reynolds barked, his voice strained but resolute. He turned to face the crew, his eyes locking with each of theirs. We need to shut this thing down before it's too late. We have no other choice. Zane, his face pale but determined, nodded. The ship's energy, it's been feeding off us. We've triggered something, but if we can disrupt the central core, we might be able to shut it down. Harrington looked at him, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. But how? The ship's alive, Zane. It's not just a machine, it's something else. I know, Zane replied, his voice grim. But if we don't try, we won't make it out alive. The ship groaned in response, the walls shifting violently as though it were aware of their intentions. The growl, once distant, now reverberated throughout the room. It was no longer a sound of pursuit, it was a warning, the ship's last attempt to hold them in its grip. Reynolds stepped forward, a fire of resolve burning in his chest. We don't have time to argue. We need to act now. The crew moved quickly, navigating through the twisting corridors, their every step a race against time. The ship seemed to fight them every step of the way, its walls warping and shifting, the lights flickering ominously overhead. But they pushed forward, driven by the need to survive. They reached the central core just as the entire ship began to hum with energy. The walls seemed to close in around them as they approached the massive chamber. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, a pulsating mass of glowing energy, suspended in the center of the room, surrounded by intricate machinery and alien symbols. This is it, Zane said, his voice tight with tension. If we can disable the core, we can stop the ship's systems from feeding off us. Reynolds nodded, his gaze fixed on the core. It was beautiful in its own terrifying way, a massive, glowing sphere that seemed to pulsate with life. But it was also a threat. A powerful, ancient force that had been locked away for so long, and now it was waking up. Harrington stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room. There must be a way to shut it down. If we can find the right command, we might be able to disrupt its power. Zane began to interface with the alien console nearby, his fingers moving quickly over the strange symbols. It's not like anything I've ever seen before, he muttered, his brow furrowing in concentration. But there's a pattern here. I think I can trace the power source. The ship trembled, its vibrations growing more intense as if it were resisting their attempts to stop it. The creature's voice echoed once more, but this time it was a whisper of desperation, its tone laced with fear. It cannot be stopped. But Zane didn't falter. His fingers flew over the controls as he followed the patterns, trying to decipher the alien language that powered the ship. It can be stopped. We just need to overload the core's systems, create a surge of energy. If we do it right, we can send the entire system into a feedback loop. Reynolds' stomach twisted. The plan was risky, dangerously so, but it was their only shot. How long? I need a few more minutes, Zane said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. If we can just... There! A bright flash erupted from the core, blinding them for a moment. The ship's hum reached a deafening crescendo, the walls shaking violently as if the black ship itself were alive, screaming in protest. The growl returned, louder now, the very air heavy with menace. Zane stepped back from the console, sweat beading on his forehead. It's done. We've triggered the overload. The ship will collapse in on itself in. Before he could finish, the ground beneath them rumbled violently, throwing them off their feet. The ship's systems began to fail, the lights flickering wildly as the core pulsed erratically. The ship was dying. The creature once human appeared in front of them, its form flickering like a broken image. Its face, still blurred and incomprehensible, turned toward them, its voice weak. You have done it. Reynolds stood, his body shaking from the impact. What happens now? The creature's voice was almost a whisper. The black ship was never meant to carry the secrets it holds. It was a prison, not a weapon. But you have freed it. And now, the universe will know what it contains. The creature's form began to fade, its image becoming more translucent, as if it were losing its grip on reality. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the ship's final, desperate tremor. And then, with one last flicker, the creature was gone. The ship groaned one final time, and the core emitted a brilliant burst of light. Then, silence. The crew slowly got to their feet, their eyes wide as they took in the aftermath. The black ship, the ancient prison, was no more. The core had imploded, and the energy that had sustained the ship was gone. The walls, once alive with movement, were now still nothing more than a silent, empty shell. Reynolds let out a long breath, his heart still racing. Is it over? Harrington asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and relief. Zane nodded, though his expression remained grim. It's over. For now. But the question remains, what exactly was the black ship guarding? What did we just unleash on the universe? Reynolds looked around the quiet, lifeless chamber. They had survived the horrors of the black ship, but the mystery remained unsolved. Whatever had been imprisoned on this ship was still out there, and now, they had opened the door for it to escape. The crew made their way back to the horizon, their movements heavy with the weight of what they had just experienced. As they boarded their ship and sealed the airlock, Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The black ship had been only a part of a much larger puzzle, a much darker force at work. We need to report this, Reynolds said, his voice filled with a mixture of caution and determination. But we need to be careful. We have no idea what we've truly unleashed. The crew nodded in agreement, their minds filled with the same questions. What had they uncovered? What had they awakened? And most importantly, who or what had been imprisoned on the black ship for so long? As the horizon lifted off, leaving the remnants of the black ship behind, a new uncertainty hung in the air. The crew had survived, but the universe had changed. And the consequences of their actions would ripple outward, reaching far beyond what they could ever imagine.